On the 15th of September, 1885, a freight train in the rail yard at St. Thomas, Ontario, struck and killed the most famous elephant on Earth. He was 24 years old, worth more than any other animal alive, and dead within minutes on the cinders beside the main line. It happened in St. Thomas because the town had built itself into a junction where trains moved through day and night, roughly every 20 minutes. 126 years later, to the day, the same calendar square came due again. On the 15th of September, 2011, at 25 minutes past noon, the last Ford Crown Victoria came off the assembly line a few kilometers from where Jumbo died, its line workers' signatures left on the floor pawn underneath. The city had not chosen either date. It had only ever been the place where other people's schedules happened to land. Chapter 1. The line that touched the ground. The geography here is a straight line, and that is nearly the whole explanation. The Canada Southern Railway was surveyed from Amherstburg on the Detroit River to Fort Erie on the Niagara, 369 kilometers end to end, 96% of it dead straight, with no grade steeper than 15 feet to the mile. It was the shortest fast route between Detroit and Chicago on one side of the lakes and Buffalo and New York on the other. St. Thomas sits almost exactly at the midpoint of that line, which is the only reason a head office came here instead of to a larger town nearby. A ruler laid across a province will always touch some point on the ground. In this case, the point was a ridge above a creek. The terrain demanded a crossing, not a city. Everything built on top of that was a decision made by people, not by the land. The creek is Kettle Creek, and the town stands on the ridge above it, about 12 kilometers inland from the natural harbor at Port Stanley on Lake Erie. The road that first brought settlers to that ridge was the Talbot Road, cut through the bush a generation before any surveyor gave a thought to grades or midpoints. Everything the city has been given since, including a battery plant now rising on farmland to the east, arrived because of where a line drawn between two other places happens to touch the ground. St. Thomas did not choose its position chose it and kept choosing it for 2 centuries. Before any of that, this was Adirondack country, the people European mapmakers called the neutrals for their studied refusal to take sides in the wars fought around them. They lived along these creeks and the shore of Lake Erie until the middle of the 17th century, when the wars over the fur trade dispersed them, and the territory passed into a long, contested quiet. It was covered afterward by the Nanfan Treaty of 1701, a Haudenosaunee land transaction with the British Crown reaching across much of what is now southern Ontario. European settlement pressed into that quiet from every direction at once in the decades that followed, and the pace of it did not slow for a treaty signature. The specific ground St. Thomas stands on was surrendered under the McKee Treaty of 1790, the southernmost of the Upper Canada surrenders, signed by the Wyandot and by Anishinaabe nations, whose descendants include the Chippewas of the Thames. Elgin County today still borders 3 First Nations, the Chippewas of the Thames, the Munsee Delaware Nation, and the Oneida Nation of the Thames. The whole region falls under the dish with one spoon, the covenant by which Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations agreed to share the hunting grounds around the lower Great Lakes rather than divide them by force. None of this made the newspapers of 1817, and none of it needed to. It was simply the condition of the land before the land carried a town's name. The McKee Treaty was signed in 1790, and the man whose name would eventually sit on the city did not arrive to start giving pieces of that land away for another 13 years. He arrived with a title, a grant, and a private book with a pencil in it. Chapter 2. The Man with the Pencil. Thomas Talbot was born at Malahide Castle in Ireland in 1771, the son of a family with land and no shortage of connections, and he had served as a soldier and as private secretary to a lieutenant governor of Upper Canada before he decided he wanted something neither career could give him. In 1803, he took a grant of 5,000 acres on the north shore of Lake Erie and settled at Port Talbot, a few kilometers west of the ridge where St. Thomas would eventually stand. What Talbot wanted was not a farm, it was a fief, and the colonial government, short on settlers and long on unclaimed land, let him have something close to one. He controlled settlement across an enormous tract of Upper Canada for decades by keeping the names of approved settlers in pencil in a private book, and erasing any man who displeased him without explanation or appeal. He was still alive when the first railway survey crossed his road, and he died in 1853, 3 years before the first train ever ran through the country he had spent half a century arranging by hand. The road he cut, muscled through the bush by the settlers who owed him their land titles, is the street this story never leaves. Downtown, it is Talbot Street. East of town, out where farmland is being cleared for a battery plant, it is Talbot Line. Both are the same road, laid down before anyone thought to ask what a railway needed from the ground. The first permanent settler on the actual town site arrived 7 years after Talbot's grant. Captain Daniel Rapelje, descended from a Walloon family that had settled New Amsterdam 2 centuries earlier, took up 80 hectares on the south side of Talbot Road at Kettle Creek in 1810, working the land with a partner named David Mandeville. Rapelje built a log grist mill in 1814 and, in 1820, divided part of his holding into town lots for sale. He donated 2 acres for the church that became Old St. Thomas Church, built in 1824 and still standing today. The settlement took its name in 1817, and the name it took was St. Thomas, after Talbot, not after the man who had actually cleared the ground and built the mill and given away the churchyard. Rapelje died in 1828, having named a town for somebody else. In 1824, under Talbot's patronage, Charles Duncombe and John Rolfe opened the first medical school in Upper Canada on that same small settlement, a detail that says something about how quickly a scattering of mill lots could acquire institutions. The municipal ladder after that climbed steadily and without much drama. County seat of the newly formed Elgin County in 1844, a village in 1852, a town in 1861. The neighboring settlement of Millersburg absorbed Hull in 1871. A city, finally, on the 4th of March, 1881. The London and Port Stanley Railway, one of the earliest lines built in Ontario, opened in 1856 and ran straight through the middle of it, from London down to the harbor at Port Stanley on the lake. By 1860, the whole place held about 1,700 people, and it earned its living the way 100 other Ontario towns did, on grain, apples, and tobacco moving to market. Nothing about it in 1860 suggested the railway capital of anything. That word was still 15 years, and one very specific bonus away. Chapter 3. $25,000. The men who decided St. Thomas would become a railway town had never been to St. Thomas. Daniel Drew, Sidney Dillon, Kenyon Cox, and John F. Tracy were New York financiers whose actual business was not laying track, but trading the paper that laying track produced, bonds, charters, leases, the instruments that moved money faster than any train could move freight. Their company was incorporated on the 28th of February, 1868, under the name Erie and Niagara Extension Railway, and renamed the Canada Southern on the 24th of December, 1869. What they were selling was a shortcut across the base of the Ontario Peninsula, and what they needed was a town willing to pay for it. St. Thomas paid. In 1870, the town council voted a bonus of $25,000 to bring the company's head office there, rather than to some other stop along the proposed line, and the company took the money. It also took land, roughly 125 hectares inside the town itself, assembled for yards, shops, and sidings before a single rail was spiked down. That is the reason the tracks run through the center of St. Thomas rather than around its edge. St. Thomas invited it into the front room. What went up next looked less like a rail depot than a bank in a capital city. Edgar Berryman, a Canadian architect who worked from 1839 to 1905, designed the Canada Southern headquarters in the Italianate style, reportedly the only railway station in the country built that way. Construction ran from June 1871 to April 1873, 354 feet long, 2 stories, 162 arched windows, raised out of 400,000 buff-colored bricks fired in nearby Yarmouth Township. Passengers in a dining room occupied the ground floor. The company's offices sat above them. The eastern half of the line opened for traffic in 1872, the western half in early 1873, and St. Thomas had its building before it had much else to put around it. The men who financed it did not stay in control of it for long. The Canada Southern went bankrupt in 1874, and within 2 years, the Vanderbilt family, through its New York Central interests, effectively owned the line. On the 1st of January, 1883, the Michigan Central leased the entire railway for 99 years, which meant the company running Canada's newest railway town was thereafter directed out of Detroit and New York rather than from the building on Talbot Street. On the 24th of January, 1898, the Wabash leased 230 miles of Grand Trunk track across southern Ontario, and put its own Canadian headquarters in St. Thomas as well, because the town sat exactly halfway between Detroit and Niagara Falls, which was the only qualification that mattered to a company headquartered somewhere else. The population answered the money. About 2,200 people in 1872, 8,367 by 1880. Roughly a fourfold increase inside 8 years. Streets filled in behind the yards. Houses went up on lots that had been pasture the decade before. None of it, from the bonus to the bricks to the bodies filling the new houses, had originated in St. Thomas. Every dollar of the boom had been decided in New York by men calculating the shortest distance between two much larger cities, and the town simply happened to be standing where the calculation landed. 15 years after that bonus check, the same rail yard would host an animal worth more than the payment itself. Chapter 4. The Most Valuable Animal in the World. By September of 1885, St. Thomas had been a city for 4 years, and it still looked, at close range, like a railway yard with houses built around it out of habit. The Barnum in London show arrived the way it arrived everywhere, by rail, traveling in its own purpose-built cars, playing a town for a day, and loading out again before the next morning's schedule. 2 performances were booked for the 15th of September, and once the crowds went home, the circus train sat on a siding inside the yard, separated from the Grand Trunk main line by nothing more than a narrow strip of cinders. Moving animals across a live main line in the dark, between a siding and a boxcar, was simply how the business worked in St. Thomas and in every other town the circus played that season. The show itself was a rail operation before it was anything else. Dozens of cars, hundreds of performers and laborers, and a schedule built around loading and unloading fast enough to make the next stand on time. The animal being walked across those tracks that night was worth more than any other living creature on Earth, and his story did not begin in Canada. He was born in the Sudan around 1860. Taken after his mother was killed and moved through a chain of dealers first to Paris and then to the Zoological Gardens in London, where he arrived on the 26th of June, 1865. His keeper there was Matthew Scott, an Englishman who had worked with animals most of his adult life before he was assigned to the new arrival, and who stayed with him for the rest of both their lives. Between them, over 17 years, they gave rides to a generation of British children, Queen Victoria's among them, and the elephant became something closer to a national fixture than a zoo exhibit, the kind of animal a country believes it owns, even though a zoo holds the deed. In 1882, P.T. Barnum bought him for £2,000, roughly $10,000, and Britain did not take the sale quietly. Something close to 100,000 schoolchildren wrote letters to the Queen, asking that the purchase be stopped, and the dispute reached a courtroom, where the zoo's right to sell him was upheld. Barnum shipped him to New York anyway, crated and reluctant, and recovered the entire purchase price in 3 weeks of exhibition, a return on investment fast enough to make the court case irrelevant to his bottom line. On the 17th of May, 1884, he walked Jumbo across the newly opened Brooklyn Bridge with 21 other elephants, a stunt engineered to prove to a nervous public that the bridge's structure could bear real weight. The posters that followed him from city to city advertised a height of 13 feet 1 inch, the largest elephant in captivity, unrivaled anywhere on the continent. The true figure was closer to 11 feet, a discrepancy of about 2.5 feet that nobody paying admission had any way to check, and Barnum had no reason to correct it, while the lie was still selling tickets. That was the animal on the siding at St. Thomas on the 15th of September, 1885. A circus attraction built as much out of publicity as out of bone, insured, advertised, and worth by Barnum's own reckoning more than any other creature alive, walking across a working railway in the dark, in a town where a train came through roughly every 20 minutes. Chapter 5. The abrasions were on his rear flank. After the second performance, the crowd dispersed, and the yard went back to its ordinary business, the same yard that moved roughly 1 train every 20 minutes. The elephants were led back across the tracks toward their boxcar in the dark, in a line, Jumbo in front, Tom Thumb behind him. An unscheduled westbound freight came onto the same stretch of track without warning. Not on the timetable, either the circus or the yard crew had been working from that evening. Its engineer, a man named William Barnum, sounded the whistle for brakes the moment the animals came into view and threw the engine into reverse, doing what a competent engineer does in the seconds available to him. It was not enough distance, and it was not enough time. There was no siding to step onto, and no clear order in which two large animals crossing a narrow strip of cinders could simply get out of the way. Jumbo was struck from behind and dragged along the rail bed for some distance before the locomotive itself left the track and came to rest in the wreckage. He was dead within a few minutes, at about 24 years old. Tom Thumb, smaller and slower, survived with a broken leg. Barnum's telegraphed account of the death reached newspapers within days, and it was a good story. Jumbo, seeing the train, had pushed Tom Thumb clear of the rails and taken the impact himself, dying as he had lived in service of the show. It traveled around the world unchallenged for more than a century, printed in newspapers and repeated in children's books. An elephant's last act framed as an act of loyalty rather than an accident of geometry and timing. The evidence does not support it. The abrasions on Jumbo's body were on his rear flank, consistent with an animal struck while running away from the train rather than standing to face it. And a modern forensic examination of his remains found massive internal trauma with almost no broken bones. The examination did not settle the matter for public memory. It only settled it for anyone willing to read past the telegram. Someone in the crowd that gathered afterward cut a piece from his ear and carried it home as a souvenir before anyone had cleared the track or moved the body, before Barnum's telegram had even reached New York. No name for that person survives in any account. Only the detail survives, flat and unexplained, the way small human facts survive around large public deaths. The autopsy performed in the days that followed found, inside his stomach, English pennies, keys, rivets, and a police whistle. Items thrown to him by spectators over 20 years of hand-feeding and swallowed without apparent difficulty by an animal that size. None of it had killed him. It was simply what strangers had fed him for 20 years, offered by hand through fences and over rails by people who never thought about where it went. It was a small inventory of a very public life. He lay on the cinders beside the main line through the rest of that night, while the yard around him kept working, because the line still needed to be cleared and the next freight was already coming, on schedule, the way freight always came through St. Thomas. Chapter 6. 6 Butchers and a Mountain. The line still had to run, so about 200 men were brought out overnight with rope and tackle to roll the carcass down the embankment and clear the main line for the next scheduled freight. A job of logistics performed on an animal that had been, 12 hours earlier, worth more than the equipment used to move him. Word spread through town overnight, and by morning, admission of 5 cents was being charged to anyone who wanted to look at him where he lay. Souvenir hunters chipped slivers from the tusks and sold them. 6 local butchers were hired to take the body apart where the crowd had left it. The viscera were burned on the spot. The fat was rendered down, bottled, and sold around town as an ointment for aches and pains. A use for the animal that outlasted the animal by years in a few medicine cabinets. The hide alone weighed 725 kilograms, and taxidermists from Ward's Natural Science Establishment in Rochester, New York, arrived within days to claim it and the skeleton on Barnum's behalf, moving with the speed of men who understood the value was already depreciating. The circus itself did not wait around for any of this. It played its next scheduled town on time, the way the schedule always ran. What Barnum did with the remains explains a century of St. Thomas's silence about the whole event, better than anything that happened at the trackside. His taxidermists, William J. Critchley and Carl Akeley, were given a specific instruction: stretch the hide, mount it taller than the living animal had ever stood, let him show like a mountain. The finished mount weighed 1,500 pounds and toured with the reassembled skeleton for 2 more seasons. And Barnum valued the pair as an attraction worth $100,000 a year, more as a stuffed exhibit than Jumbo had earned most years alive. Alice had never lived with Jumbo, had likely never met him, and none of that mattered to the arrangement Barnum built around her. In 1886, he bought her from the London Zoo and advertised her as Jumbo's grief-stricken widow, mourning at the feet of her stuffed husband for the price of admission. A second act of invention layered directly on top of the first. The skeleton eventually went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. The mount went to Tufts College in 1889, where generations of students rubbed its trunk for luck before an electrical fire destroyed it in 1975. What survives of it now is ash, kept in a peanut butter jar in an athletic director's office. Matthew Scott, who had spent 20 years at that animal's side and none of the money it generated afterward, either alive or stuffed, died in a poorhouse in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1914, a long way in both distance and circumstance from the mounted hide still touring under his old charge's name. A century later, researchers measured what was left and found a smaller animal than anyone had been sold a ticket to see, about 3.2 meters at the shoulder, 10 feet 7 inches, not the 13 feet on the old posters. His teeth had been deformed by a soft captive diet, and his joints showed the wear of an animal 3 times his actual age. He was 24 when he died, with the joints of an elephant nearer 60. The word jumbo, meaning something large and clumsy, was already circulating in English slang by 1823, decades before this particular elephant was born, so Barnum did not coin it. What the elephant did was fix the word permanently into the language, in its modern sense of enormous, which means the single most durable thing ever produced in St. Thomas, Ontario, is an adjective. Chapter 7. 100 trains. A day. By the 1890s, 8 railways were operating through St. Thomas at once, moving more than 100 trains a day through a city that had started the century as a market town for apples and grain. The Casso station on Talbot Street ranked among the busiest in the country through the 1920s, its platforms rarely empty for more than a few minutes at a stretch, and the town began calling itself, without much modesty and without much argument from anyone, the railway capital of Canada. Nobody in Ottawa or Toronto disputed the title. In 1913, the Michigan Central built locomotive repair shops on the east side of the yard, 52,000 square feet. $250,000, more than 400 men working at peak, forging and fitting the parts that kept the rest of the operation moving. Locomotives themselves had been built in that yard since 1882, 3 decades before the shops that repaired them went up, which meant St. Thomas built trains, not merely moved them through. The street railway told its own version of the same growth: horse cars in 1879, electric cars in 1898, city-owned cars in 1902, when St. Thomas bought the system outright rather than leave it to a private operator. The City of London leased the London and Port Stanley line in 1914 and ran electric passenger service on it from the 1st of July, 1915, carrying commuters and day trippers down to the harbor at a pace no horse-drawn line could have matched. One architect, Neil R. Darach, designed enough of the city's civic buildings that his name is stamped across the skyline almost by accident: the City Hall, the Elgin County Courthouse, the Wellington Street, Balaclava Street, and Elmdale schools, each of them paid for by a tax base that a railway boom had made possible in a single generation. Alma College had opened as a women's college in 1881, and the Times Journal, the paper that would chronicle all of it, had been printing under one name or another since 1831. Picture Talbot Street on a Saturday evening in 1926. The shops stay open past their usual hour because railway pay comes in heavy and predictable, and men with cash in their pockets are still on the sidewalk after supper. Interurban cars run down toward the lake every few minutes, loaded with families headed for Port Stanley's dance halls and the cooler air off the water. Underneath all of it, audible if the wind sits right, is the sound of the yard 3 blocks over, working its 3rd shift of the day the way it worked every day, because the railway did not know the difference between a Saturday and a Tuesday. Freight cars couple and uncouple somewhere out of sight. A whistle sounds for a crossing, then another, further off, then a third. Nobody on Talbot Street stops walking to listen for it. It has been the sound of the city for so long that it has stopped being a sound at all and become instead the condition the rest of the evening happens inside of. 4 years later, in 1930, the city opened its 3rd bridge over Kettle Creek, 850 feet long, 95 feet above the water, built for $689,000, and engineered to carry up to 50 trains a day across a gorge that had defeated two earlier structures. It was the last major piece of railway infrastructure St. Thomas would ever build. Chapter 8. They did not collapse, they withdrew. On the 12th of February 1926, the St. Thomas Street Railway ran its last car after 47 years of service and was quietly replaced by buses. It was a routine transit decision, the kind a council makes and a newspaper reports in a paragraph on an inside page, and nobody at the time treated it as the opening line of anything. Buses were cheaper, more flexible, and did not need track maintained under them. There was nothing in the decision that looked like the beginning of a withdrawal. It took another 70 years to find out that it was. Passenger service on the London and Port Stanley ended on the 18th of February 1957. The Michigan Central shops closed the following year, in 1958, because diesel locomotives needed almost none of the repair work a steam depot had been built to provide. Canadian National bought the London and Port Stanley line in 1965. The Michigan Central's American parent was folded into Penn Central in 1968. Canada Southern passenger traffic ended on the 31st of January 1979. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific jointly bought the line in the mid-80s, and what they wanted from the purchase was the border crossings at either end of it, at the Detroit River and the Niagara, not the town sitting at the midpoint. Freight service wound down through the rest of the decade. The shops were sold in 1988. The line and station closed around 1990. The last train of any kind crossed the bridge over Kettle Creek in 1996. A shop closure here, a lease sold there, a route deemed no longer worth the maintenance. It arrived as one timetable change after another, over 7 decades, until there was simply nothing left on the schedule to cancel. In 1967, while the railways were still contracting, Ford opened an assembly plant on 635 acres at Talbotville, just south of the city. And St. Thomas traded one single industry for another, almost without a pause between them. The building covered 2.6 million square feet, a single roof larger than most of downtown St. Thomas put together, and turned out, across its life, the Falcon, then the Maverick, the Pinto, the Fairmont, the LTD Crown Victoria, the Mercury Grand Marquis, the Marauder, and, from 2007, the Lincoln Town Car. More than 8 million vehicles came off that line over 44 years, the Crown Victoria among them becoming, in its own right, the standard police car of North America. Assembly wages there eventually reached $33.90 an hour, and the plant paid about $2.3 million a year in taxes to a township of only a few thousand people. In 1997, Ford sold its heavy truck operation to Freightliner, and the plant reopened next door as Sterling Trucks, another 1,400 jobs at around $29 an hour, so that by the turn of the millennium, the two plants together were paying out wages the railway era would have recognized as its own. By the year 2000, the city had done exactly what it had done in 1870, bet everything it had on being the most convenient place for somebody else's continental operation to sit down. It had worked the first time for a century. It was about to stop working inside a single decade. Chapter 9. 1 resident in 7. Daimler announced the end of Sterling Trucks in October of 2008. In the same season, the wider financial system was seizing up on 2 continents, and the plant stopped production the following March, taking about 1,400 jobs with it. ZF Heavy Duty Steering, a supplier tied to the same line, closed that December. Lear announced its own closure not long after that. 3 shutdowns inside little more than a year, each one independently defensible on a balance sheet somewhere far from St. Thomas, Stuttgart, Friedrichshafen, Southfield, Michigan, and each one landing in the same small labor market at almost the same time, so that a worker laid off from one plant found the next plant over laying people off as well. Ford held on longer, but not much longer, and the plant at Talbotville had by then been building vehicles on that site for 44 years, longer than most of the people watching it wind down had been alive. Its last vehicle, a white Crown Victoria with a tan interior, built to order for a customer in Saudi Arabia, came off the line at 25 minutes past noon on the 15th of September, 2011. The assembly workers' own signatures left on the floor fan underneath the carpet where no inspector would ever look for them. It was 126 years to the day since a freight train killed Jumbo a few kilometers from that same stretch of track. Nobody at Ford had engineered the date. It was simply where the production math landed, in a town built, from its first bonus check, to run on other people's timetables. About 5,000 jobs disappeared from St. Thomas in those 3 years, in a city of roughly 36,000 people, which works out to something close to 1 resident in 7 losing a paycheck. The Globe and Mail called it the hardest hit city in the country, and for a stretch afterward, the local unemployment rate ranked among the highest anywhere in Canada, a distinction no council had ever campaigned to earn. The arithmetic looked worse the closer to street level it was measured. The service and call center jobs that opened in place of the assembly work paid $10.25 to $15 an hour, against the $29 to $34 an hour the plants had paid. One call center job fair alone drew more than 100 applicants competing for a handful of positions, starting at $10.25. Men and women who had spent careers building cars now lined up for phone work. John LaCroix, 52 years old, laid off from Sterling in 2007 after 30 years of never once missing a bill, lost his house in Port Stanley to foreclosure in December of 2008, a year into a downturn that had not yet reached its worst point. 30 years of payments had bought him nothing that survived 1 year without a paycheck behind it. And his was one name among many the county's social agencies would spend the next 3 years trying to keep track of. United Way receipts across the county fell from $1.2 million to $712,000 in 2010. Exactly the year the need for that money was highest. The donors and the recipients drawn from overlapping lists of the same laid-off households. These were the second generation of St. Thomas workers to be told a continental employer had chosen their town for them, following the fathers and mothers who had signed on when Ford first arrived in 1967. They were the first generation to hear that sentence run in reverse and to watch it happen twice, at 2 different plants, inside the same 3 years. Across town, in that same window, other buildings were closing for reasons that had nothing to do with Ford or Sterling at all. Chapter 10. The Census Nobody Read. Alma College closed in 1988 after 107 years as a women's college, and stood empty for 2 decades afterward, useful mainly as a set for film crews looking for a building that photographed like ruin without being one. On the 28th of May, 2008, it burned to the ground. The fire was arson, and 2 local youths, aged 15 and 16, were charged in connection with it. The building that Neil R. Darrich's contemporaries had helped make into one of the city's landmarks went down in a single evening, decades after the last graduating class had walked out of it for good. The psychiatric hospital on Sunset Drive opened in April of 1939 on 460 acres and, at its height, held around 2,400 patients. It closed in 2013, and all 22 buildings on the site were scheduled for demolition. Before any of that, in September of 1939, the Department of National Defense had taken the same site over for a Royal Canadian Air Force Technical Training School, which put roughly 50,000 personnel through St. Thomas before it closed on the 30th of April, 1945. 1 property, 2 closures, a war, and a hospital era folded into the same 460 acres. The building switching institutional purpose twice without ever once becoming anything a private buyer wanted to take on. The Sutherland Press Building at 606 Talbot Street, a printing works running since 1927 that had once turned out the town's own newspaper, came down in 2017 after years of structural failure and legal argument over who was responsible for it. The site today is a vacant lot on the city's main street. Weeds and gravel where a working press once ran, 3 closures on 3 separate properties inside a single decade. None of that, read in sequence, looks like the record of a town holding steady. A college burned, a hospital closed and scheduled its own demolition. A newspaper's old plant came down and left a gap on the main street. Anyone reading only the buildings would assume the population underneath them was shrinking to match. The census says otherwise. 30,332 people in 1991, 32,275 in 1996, 33,236 in 2001, 36,110 in 2006, then 37,905 in 2011. The same year, Ford closed its doors for good. 38,909 in 2016, 42,840 in the 2021 census, and an estimate near 49,000 by 2025. Every one of those counts moved in the same direction, decade after decade, straight through the plant closures that a visitor reading only the headlines would have assumed were emptying the place out. Through the worst 3 years of its industrial history, the population of St. Thomas went up, not down, because London sits 15 minutes to the north, and the city had quietly become somewhere people lived rather than somewhere they worked. The employers left. The town did not. That single fact, sitting undramatically inside a Statistics Canada table nobody outside the planning department was reading closely, is the actual shape of what happened here. St. Thomas did not become a ghost town, and it did not need rescuing. It grew through the entire collapse, one commuter household at a time, and it is the reason there was still a functioning city standing in exactly the right location when the next call came in from a much larger buyer. Chapter 11. The largest factory in Canada. In April of 2023, Volkswagen's battery subsidiary PowerCo announced its first factory outside Europe, and it was going up on farmland at the corner of Talbot Line and Yarmouth Centre Road, the same road Colonel Talbot cut through the bush 220 years earlier. 1,500 acres of industrial park, with the main production building alone running to about 1.5 million square feet, made it the largest factory ever built in Canada. Up to $7 billion is set to be invested by 2030, producing up to 90 gigawatt hours of battery capacity a year in its final phase, enough cells for roughly 1 million electric vehicles annually. 3,000 direct jobs are projected on site, with something closer to 30,000 more counted indirectly across the surrounding region in suppliers, contractors, and the businesses that grow up around any workforce that size. It stands as the single largest automotive investment ever made in Canada, arriving 14 years after this same city was named the country's hardest hit in the layoffs of 2008 to 2011. What the announcements left out was how the land underneath it was actually assembled. The province passed the St. Thomas and Central Elgin Boundary Adjustment Act, known as Bill 63, allowing the city to annex roughly 1,500 acres of farmland, wetland, and woodlot, most of it out of the neighboring municipality of Central Elgin. Something close to 1,200 of those acres came directly out of Central Elgin, more than 400 of them already zoned industrial, which removed the bulk of that smaller municipality's own tax base in a single stroke. Central Elgin's mayor, Andrew Sloan, said he had been taken completely off guard since the annexation proceeded without consultation with his council. Central Elgin was later given about $80 million in offsets and has been looking at new housing development to replace the assessment it lost. A municipality of a few thousand people negotiating after the fact for a fraction of what had already been decided above it. Beyond the plant site itself, farms along the corridors needed for water, sewer, and power were being expropriated. And in 2025, farmers along those roads were still describing the province's offers as far below what the land was actually worth. The soil underneath all of it ranks among the most productive farmland in Ontario, and every acre of that decision was made deliberately by a province that knew exactly what it was trading away. The public price of the plant runs even higher than the private one. Up to $13.2 billion in federal production subsidies are available over 10 years, scaled to how many battery cells actually leave the building. $700 million comes through federal capital grants under the Strategic Innovation Fund, and $500 million more comes directly from the province of Ontario, on top of all the water, sewer, and road spending underneath it that the city and Central Elgin are carrying themselves. The federal production subsidy itself only remains in force as long as the American Inflation Reduction Act remains law south of the border, which means the largest industrial subsidy in Canadian history is pinned to a statute Canada does not control, written by a legislature in Washington and subject to repeal by a Congress St. Thomas has no vote in. In 1870, the town council paid $25,000 to bring a railway head office to St. Thomas. In 2023, The country pledged up to $13.2 billion to bring a battery factory to the same stretch of road. The logic of the transaction has not changed in 150 years. Only the number of zeros has. Chapter 12. What is standing at the end of the line? Site preparation on the PowerCo land finished in 2024. Major contracts were awarded through 2025, and by the summer of 2026, steel was going up vertically across the property. 850,000 square feet of foundation across 3 buildings, more than 32,000 cubic meters of concrete, 4,850 tons of reinforcing steel. Maggle Construction Canada poured them. SteelCon is erecting the structure above, with more than 500 people on site. PowerCo had hired more than 200 employees by early 2026 and has fixed cell production for 2027, chasing Chief Executive Frank Blom's stated goal of a global battery champion. The company also says the ramp-up will be demand-driven and phased, a polite phrase for a plain warning. The building finishes on schedule. The volume it fills with depends on the market. The city is rebuilding water mains, trunk sewers, roads, and power for an industrial load larger than everything else in St. Thomas combined. Home sales here led the London region through 2025, average price around $618,000 by spring 2026. The old psychiatric hospital land on Sunset Drive is planned for roughly 3,500 homes. The railway inventory still stands mostly. The Casso station remains at 810 Talbot Street, 354 feet, 162 arched windows, empty about 15 years before the North America Railway Hall of Fame took it over in 2005. Its main hall is rented out for weddings now. The 1913 Michigan Central shops became the Elgin County Railway Museum and suspended operations in January of 2026 because a building raised to repair locomotives can no longer hold up its own roof. The 1930 bridge over Kettle Creek, bought with 4 kilometers of corridor by a local group in 2013, reopened in September 2019 as the St. Thomas Elevated Park, the first structure of its kind in Canada, 95 feet above water, carrying nothing now but the creek. 7 miles of the old London and Port Stanley line still run down to the lake as the Port Stanley Terminal Rail, about 25,000 excursion riders a year. No scheduled passenger train has stopped here in 47 years. The jumbo inventory is shorter than the railways. St. Thomas holds no part of the animal itself. Skeleton in New York, Mount burned at Tufts in 1975, heart sold to Cornell and later lost, ashes in a jar in Massachusetts. What the city has instead is a statue. 38 tons of concrete and steel sculpted by Winston Barnum, paid for with $70,000 raised partly by selling commemorative coins and safari hats, hauled 1,722 kilometers from Sussex, New Brunswick, erected in 1985, a full century after the death it commemorates. Railway City, the local brewery, sells an India Pale Ale called Dead Elephant, the story printed on the can. Amazon opened a fulfillment center on the old Ford site on the 1st of October, 2023. Masco Canada makes plumbing fixtures inside the former Sterling plant. Takumi Stamping has grown past 500 employees in a building that once stamped parts for somebody else's assembly line. Downtown, the vacant lot at 606 Talbot Street is still a vacant lot, gravel and weeds where a printing press once ran. 4 blocks west, a concrete elephant stands facing the traffic on its 100-ton base, gray against the sky in every weather. 5 kilometers east, steel columns are rising on ground that grew corn 2 summers ago, paid for by a subsidy pinned to a foreign statute, for a market that has not yet decided how fast it wants what the building will make. Underneath all of it, in places, the old rails still run dead straight beneath the grass from the Detroit River to the Niagara, through a city that was never, in 160 years, anyone's actual destination.